And there's a way in which Joseph sort of exists, I think, in our collective theological imagination as just kind of this guy who,
The guy who pays
got
the
Mary
bills.
to Bethlehem, or the guy who, it's
He's
like,
the
oh
guy
yeah,
who leads the
Joseph.
donkey. He's the guy who
Yeah,
knocks on the inn door. That's it.
right.
Hi, everybody. I'm Reverend Jim Keat, the digital minister at the Riverside Church.
And I'm Reverend Adriene Thorne, the senior minister at the Riverside Church. And this is The Word Made Fresh.
The Word Made Fresh is your weekly video Bible study, sermon prep, Bible geek resource. If you want to learn about this book, we are going to dive in and talk about it. We cover the narrative lectionary, and that brings us this coming Sunday to Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 to 25. I want to just pause and say, we made it. We're into the Gospels. I mean, nothing again. The Hebrew scriptures are rich and beautiful, and the prophets and the narratives, but it's just like, okay, here we go. This story's got a new character, which is where we get introduced to in this particular passage. What's going on here in Matthew? What is this setting up? I think people might know because Christmas is coming, but kind of catch us up.
So it's setting up the birth. Mary and Joseph are married. Technically, they're married, but they haven't yet come together. So they're still living in their separate households. They haven't known each other. They haven't come together, whatever euphemism the gospel writer uses in your translation. But it becomes apparent or clear that Mary is pregnant. And Joseph, and I love this about Joseph, being a righteous man. So righteous can mean, follows the law, follows the rules. But in this particular instance, it means that Joseph, was a person of integrity. He didn't want to cause Mary harm. Although the law gave him the right to dismiss her publicly and to even have her stoned to death for being pregnant before they had come together, he, being a righteous man, decides to dismiss her quietly. And that actually, I think, is going to be the title for my sermon, Quietly, because Joseph's story is quiet. It doesn't get talked about much. It's interesting that he is another Joseph who has a dream, like
Interesting.
another Joseph that we know, that God comes to him. Oh,
Which makes sense that it's in Matthew, because Matthew's gospel is often alluding to the Hebrew scriptures. So there's an obvious parallel for the readers or the hearers of this gospel to be like, oh, I know a Joseph who dreams. That's
there
I
you
hadn't thought of
go.
that before.
There you go. So God appears, an angel of the Lord appears to Joseph in a dream. Everything gets smoothed out. He decides to marry Mary, to stay together, and to see what God is going to do. This is an inbreaking of God, made possible, I think, because of Joseph. And it's interesting to me. It has always intrigued me whether or not this story can get told without Joseph. But he's such a minor character. So I love the seasons of Advent, or the rhythms of the liturgical calendar that allow us to focus on this very important character, I think, who gets a little bit of short shrift.
It's interesting how, it's ironic, I guess, that the man is the character who's not often in the spotlight in this story. And so we're bringing him from the margin to the center, which is, I think appropriate. The questions you ask are interesting. Like, what if it had been someone else? What if Mary had been betrothed to anyone else who wasn't that kind of righteous man, who was the more, well, the book says to do it this way, and so dismissed her and had the whole thing blow up in everyone's face. And Joseph played a unique and often unnoticed role in how that all came to be.
Right. And what I think is interesting about him that makes him a little different from just any old man in the Bible is that he is a man who is a parent. And I think in a lot of instances, men who are parents or men who are connected to children, even in our society today, are marginalized. If something happens with a child, or a decision is to be made about a child very often, or even if a child, is going to pick a parent to run to if something is hurting, it's like, Mom, and I love that. But I think it's just interesting to notice how that lands for Joseph. So my dad was a pretty involved parent, but he was born in the 40s and did the traditional dad things. And I remember the heartbreak of hearing him say once, "I'm just the guy who pays the bills." And there's a way in which Joseph sort of exists, I think, in our collective theological imagination as just kind of this guy who,
The guy who pays
got
the
married
bills.
to Bethlehem, or the guy who, it's
He's
like,
the
oh
guy
yeah,
who leads the
Joseph.
donkey. He's the guy who
Yeah.
knocks on the inn door. That's it,
Right. He's just kind of there to kind of balance out the nativity scene, right? He's not really critical. I mean, the Holy Spirit, made the baby come. Um, and we're laughing about it and joking about it. The focus, of course, is that Jesus is coming to be God with us. But I really loved reading in one of the commentaries this week that God was with Joseph also in this sort of liminal space where Joseph needed to do a thing for
Yeah.
Emmanuel to get here, and he did it.
Because we get that language in here. What is it? The angel quotes, is it Isaiah? The virgin shall conceive and
Mhm.
bear a son. They shall name him Emmanuel, which means God
Yes,
with us.
God with us. Yeah, such a beautiful notion too. This notion of God being with us. I was just thinking as we are almost wrapping up Advent and doing the most at this time of the year. The invitation, I think, is for us to do so much less so that we can have an experience of God being with us. Isn't it interesting that in the napping and in the dreaming, that's when Joseph has the
Yeah.
appearance of the angel? It's not in the shopping and the baking and the gift wrapping. It's in the sleeping and the resting, the hibernation and the pulling in that Jesus that Jesus is father, that God speaks to Joseph, and Joseph has this inbreaking in a moment of doing less.
Well, and that's a theme we see carried on, just a few pages and a few years further down this Christmas story, when Joseph's warned again in a dream to flee from Herod. That's a couple years to come still. That's the Magi story, but it kind of reoccurs, that same theme of Joseph the dreamer, which is interesting to point out, but also God being with us in those moments of rest and calm, which can then often lead to activity, fleeing from oppression. But still, it's the reminder that when do we hear God? Sometimes we're just too busy making noise to even hear what might be said. So we need moments and seasons and invitations of stillness and silence, and whether it's as simple as lighting an Advent candle, or an extra moment in Downward Dog in the morning, whatever it might be,
Right?
to give you that stillness, to maybe even
Exactly.
pause the noise and hear something and find God with us.
Pause the noise. Oh, I'm reminded of something you said, Reverend Jim, years ago when we were working together in another church, that the bushes are always on fire. Now, of course,
Mm.
we're mixing our metaphors and our stories, but talking about Moses. But this notion you suggested that the bushes are always on fire, that God is always with us, that the inbreaking is always happening if we have but eyes to see it. And our vibes and our spidey senses awake enough to notice, in the flowers, in the rain, in our children, in the beat of our heart and the surge of our breath. God is everywhere. Someone would say with each inhale and exhale, that breath is the Holy Spirit breathing us, breathing the world through us. That is so powerful, which is why I think that Emmanuel, God with us verse, gets me every Advent, because it's that close, it's that palpable. Until we exhale our last breath, God is with us, in us. You say around us, despite us. There God is.
Which is such a essential reminder. I mean, it's right there in the Christmas story, but
Yeah.
like you said, it's the frenetic nature of the
Mhm.
whirlwind that is Thanksgiving to Christmas that we probably need this reminder the most.
The most.
Christmas comes so quickly, and we have to have moments to pump the brakes and to pause from it all and not get swept up in just wrapping gifts and cleaning up wrapping paper and whatever comes next. And yeah,
Mhm.
that is a word right there.
And then, of course, wanting to live that Christmas spirit all year round, because the baby's getting born in us and around us all year round. God
Yeah.
never stops being God with us.
So this is the final Sunday of Advent. Do I have my calendar right? Yeah,
You're
the
correct.
18th.
It'll be
So the
Christmas
following
next week.
following week is Christmas.
Hmm.
What is that? How do you handle that? How do you approach the fourth Sunday of Advent, knowing where in just 7 days this story is going to quickly turn to Jesus, and then the narrative lectionary really just takes us off. Jesus gets groaned up really fast, and he's baptized like a week later. How do you just dive into, particularly because this is a story we do hear every year, we are all so familiar with it, how
Right.
do you just invite us to hold these familiar texts in maybe fresh ways?
Hmm. How to hold them. Well, I always find that taking these texts and reading them out loud is very powerful. It's easy, I think, with familiar text to glance over them if you're reading it in your mind. So I think to slow down and chew on the words. I love to read the text super slow, and that's how things will jump out at me. Like, um, that Joseph was going to quietly dismiss his wife. And so that word quietly made me think about actually, Joseph is a very quiet character in the Bible. And that word quietly wasn't associated with him, but I made that connection. I think we can make connections like that if we slow down and read the text slowly. I also think having these sorts of conversations about familiar texts help us to hold them in different ways because we think we know. It's like, oh, I know that story. I don't, there's nothing new to say. But you sit down with a friend and say, what do you think about Joseph? And it's great, I think, to see what they come back with, or what you together, like we just have done, cook up just because you're bouncing ideas off of each other.
I love that. It is so needed. It's things like this Christmas story. It's, I think, the Lord's Prayer, the 23rd Psalm. Those becomes the things that we're just like, Lord is my shepherd. Da, 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 Valley of shadow of death. Am I done?
Goodness and
But when
mercy.
you
Oh,
yeah, when you slow down and read them aloud, it allows the nuances of the actual language to just show up in a new and fresh way.
right. And the
That is
power, I
really
think,
cool.
of God's love to show up in new and fresh ways. You take those
Yeah.
familiar texts like the 23rd Psalm, read them slowly, or have your kid read them to you. And you're like
Mm.
almost in tears by the time it's over because you're like,
Ooh.
oh my gosh, this is beautiful stuff. This is good
That's a great
poetry.
approach. Just hear it from a different voice.
A different voice.
That
Yeah.
will force you to hear it differently. Oh, I
Yeah.
like that. I like
Yeah.
that.
Absolutely.
Oh, well, as always, it's going to be, I think, a great sermon. Maybe I'm biased because, I think all your sermons are great, but I think this is going to be fantastic. I'm eager to hear what you cook up. So Riversiders, if you're looking forward to this sermon, and anyone else who's watching this, just join us on Sunday for worship in person online, or watch the recording after the fact and see where this goes. And Christmas is coming, and the narrative lectionary is going to pick up in with these new characters. I'm kind of excited. Yeah, I'm just excited to see where the story goes. It's going to be a lot of
Me
fun
too. It's
for
going to
the
be
weeks
great
and months
fun.
to come. Yeah.
Hmm.
All right. Well, we'll hear a sermon in a few days, and we'll talk to
Okay.
you all again next week.
Next week. See you.